Hi, this is Mike Hibbert back with another Ruby on Rails tutorial for you, and this time around we're going to look at how to create a URL shortening application with Ruby on Rails. So previously in other tutorials we've demonstrated how to create controllers and models and that sort of thing. Now we're going to actually take a look at a little step further of how to make a little bit more business logic go on in the background using your controllers. Now, to start off, I've already created a database and configured my database YML file, as it says here, just for the username and password inside of there. So inside of my database I've got a database called URL if you want to say it that way, and inside of there we're going to create some tables using Rails. Now, the first thing that we normally do is we create ourselves a controller, and that's basically using the Rails G command, and we should end up with a controller like this. Now, to actually create the database we need to be specific about the kinds of things that we're going to store. But now, for a URL shortener, we have the original URL that was shortened, and we have the ID or the identifier that the URL shortener should then process and be able to recognize the old URL with. So when you go to something like bit.ly, you'll go and it'll have the bit.ly website address and then / and then a strange little code on the end, and that's the identifier that we're going to store. So for that I'm going to store the original URL, then I'm going to store that as a string, but then I'm also going to store the random ID that we're going to generate inside of our controller, and we're going to keep those two in so that later, once we've created shortened URLs, we can then use that ID in our show method, or our show action rather, to then do a redirect, so that we can use that code as a way of reprocessing or restoring. That's it, restoring the original URL and passing it through to what we originally meant. So URL shortening is just basically meant to save on characters and that sort of thing, so we don't necessarily want to see the full URL initially, but later we do want it to be usable. So that's how we'll do that, and it'll become more obvious as we go through how exactly that works. Right, so we've created our model, and we've also created our controller. So controller here, the model there. In the roots we need to add a root. In fact, we need to add a couple of roots so that we can use the controller inside of the Rails framework. So the first thing I'm going to add inside of the roots.rb file, which is down here in config, just scroll down a bit, in the config folder under roots.rb, we're going to add in two lines. The first line is root to redirect URLs new. Now what this does is it says that whenever we visit our Rails website at the basic address, so no specific controller or view specified, that's the root view. So we're going to say that the root view actually doesn't go to where it currently does, which is this welcome aboard page. It wants to forward through to our URL's new action. So the first page you should see when you open up this web app is the new page, and that's going to be basically a form where you'll input a URL and then press a button, and it will automatically generate a random ID and a brand new URL for it, which is shortened, and then pass you through to a list of other ones that we've already stored. So this is basically redirecting the front page through to the new page, so that we'll always see the new page first of all. The next bit is just to basically establish that there's the URL's controller and it's got its various different actions. So that's the only 2 lines of code we're going to add into there. In our model file, we're going to say that the original needs to be validated, and then what we're going to validate it for is presence. So presence equals true basically means check to see if there is anything in the original part of the form. So there'll be a form element called original, and it'll check that, and if there's nothing in there, that will cause a validation error. Okay, so that's our model and our routes set up. In our controller, we're going to add a few actions, 4 in total. So the first one we're going to add is the most obvious, which is just our index, and that's literally just going to have all of the URLs pulled out of the database and put into that variable there for use in the view. The next one we're going to put in is the show URL. Now this is where we will pull out the requested URL or the shortened URL by its ID, and we're going to check in the database for its random ID. So do you remember we said on the command where we created our model that it has a random ID attribute, which is a string. We're going to say use the ID passed in the parameters to search in the URLs where the random ID is equal to that, and then bring out the first one in there. Now if you don't use this first method, the object returned is not really what you're after. It's not the object where you can then start and access the various different attributes. You get something completely different, and you may even find that you get some strange errors. So it's always important that when you're searching for one specific thing, always call that first method on the end, just to make sure that it pulls out a proper object for you to be able to use. Next, we're just going to basically check to see if URL came back with anything. If it does, then we're going to redirect to what's inside of the original attribute inside of the URL object. So if that's filled with google.com, then it'll redirect to Google. Instead of showing this page, it'll just do a forced redirect through to there. If the URL isn't found, then we're just going to render the index again. So we're going to go back to the main page, and the index will have a list of all the shortened URLs available. So that's our show action done. The next bit is basically to create our new and create actions, so that we can actually take input from the user of new URLs, shorten them, create them in the system, and then pass back to the index page. So the first one is new URL, or the new action rather. We get a new URL out of there because we're going to pass this to a form, and we need at least a blank URL object to pass through, so that the form methods will be able to know how to construct the form in HTML. So we create a new one there, but next we're going to do a little bit of bit more advanced logic within our controller, so that we can demonstrate how you can do more than just load up views and pull out all of the records in the database or one. So in here we're going to work out how to create the random string that we're going to use as an identifier, and most of the time you'll find that that's usually a mixture between uppercase and lowercase alphanumeric characters. And with that, we're going to stick to characters between A to Z lowercase and A to Z uppercase, and we're going to create an array here with those in there, then map through that and iterate through all of those, and for every character that should be in those arrays, we're going to turn it to ASCII. That should then generate us a couple of arrays within arrays, which will then be flattened into one flat array of these ASCII characters. So that will give us the lowercase and uppercase characters that we need. Once we've generated that, we've got that list of letters there. We're then going to do a little bit of an iteration from 0 to 8 using the map function to basically do a little loop through all of these iterations. So basically for 0 to 8 times, we're going to index into the letters random using the random function or the rand function, and we're going to tell it that it's the maximum number that we can use in the rand selection process is the length of the letters. So it's not going to pull out anything that's beyond the bounds of that array. So it'll pick a random number and select a letter from inside of this array that we've just generated here, and then once it's done that 8 times, we will join the remainder up, which should be an array of 8 randomly selected characters. We're going to join that up and just make it into a string. All that in one little line. Then once we've generated that little string, we're going to pass it back into the URL object's random ID attribute, and then that will be automatically inserted into the form as a hidden field for when we want to create the actual existing object in the database. So that's our new method. The next method is to just say what happens when we create this. So we know that new is the page that shows the actual form, but when you submit the form, it'll get passed back, but it'll be passed back to the create method, not the new method. So with that, we need to define what is a permitted value that we can use to pass back to our create or our new method on the URL object model. And we'll basically do that by saying URL params, which is a function, returns params require URL, permit original and random ID. So those will be 2 parts of the form that will be passed back, and we're saying that these are valid and okay to be put into the arguments of the URL new function under mass assignment. And if you remember last time, we were talking about mass assignment being where you can pass multiple values into the creation method or the new method for a model, and it does need a little bit of security around that, because we don't want people being able to set every single attribute on a model. We want them to be able to set some of them, but for security reasons we only allow, and in this case we've only allowed 2, we only allow certain attributes to be accessed and updated or created. So here's our create method, or action rather, and as I said, we're going to pass in the what's returned from our URL params function, which should be these 2 values here out of the params from the post back from the new method, and that should create us a new object which would then contain the URL that the user's passed in plus this randomly generated random ID that we've created in the new method. So then we simply try to save it, and if that's successful, then we redirect back to the index page using the URLs path. If not, then we'll render the new page, and that will give the user a chance to try again, and we're going to also include a little bit of feedback as to what went wrong if that wasn't able to save. Okay, right, so we've got our model done, we've got our routes set up, and we've done the various different actions that our app Rails app needs to do. We just need to define our views. So the views are basically inside of the app folder under app views, URLs, and I've included an index html.erb file, embedded Ruby, and I've included a new html.erb, and that's all we need. The other parts of this are the actions that don't need any views. So show doesn't need a view because it always just redirects away. URL params never gets called by the user, so that's an internally used function. Create never shows anything, it simply creates a new URL and redirects or passes back to the new page. So we only need 2 views for this. So let's do the most simple one, which is our index. And inside the index we're just going to put some HTML. We're going to put early URLs, and for each of the URLs that we've pulled out using the URL.all function inside of the index, for each of those we're going to process the URL and we're going to put a link on the page in a paragraph tag. So using the link to method as normal inside of the less than percentage equals percentage greater than brackets, we're going to link to the random ID, which will be the title for the URL, or the text for the URL rather. Then we're going to use URL path, but this time instead of allowing it just to specify the ID for us like we did in a previous tutorial, we're going to say that we don't want to use the actual ID attribute, we want to use the random ID attribute as our ID in the URL. So that will give us, instead of having a number which will relate to the ID in the database, it will have those random characters in the URL instead. Okay, and then finally we've got a bit of text on the end that just says this is really pointing to what the original URL value is. Okay, and that's that for that. Although we could put a link on to say shorten another URL, so that will pass us back to the new page. And again, we're using the new URL path for the routing inside of there. Okay, right. Last final part is basically to create the form for our new URL, so that we can submit a new URL, have it shortened, and add it to the list of shortened URLs that we've already created. So the first thing we do is just stick a title in there just for the sake of identifying that page. Then this is where we're going to start adding feedback to the user. We're going to look inside of the URL object that we've created on the new page, and inside of there there's an errors attribute, or an array rather, and inside of there for each of the pieces of information that's in the error there's an attribute and a message. If there are any errors, that will print out. If there are no errors, this code shouldn't execute and we wouldn't see any output from that. But all we're going to do is we're going to output the message on with the word on in between attributes. So you should get something along the lines of the field was empty on such and such an attribute. And that's how we feed back to the user that there were errors in the process of trying to save the record. The next step is just to use the form for function as we used it in the previous tutorials. Form for will take the URL object and look inside of it and create us a form object that we can then use to build a form specifically for this. So the first thing we're going to do inside of that is just create a label using f.label for the original field of the object, and then put a text field next to that. So that's basically bog standard, create a normal field with a label on it. But the next part is we're going to add in a hidden field that we haven't, which is what we haven't done before. The reason why we're going to add in a hidden field is because we want to auto generate this this new ID in the new action. We want it to be inside of there, and we want it to be included in the form, so that when we press the submit button on the form, it passes that random ID through and gets passed in using our URL params as the random ID. So to do that, we add in one line, and it is f.hiddenField, so the hidden field method for random ID. So basically create a hidden field for random ID with the value being set to the current value that we've created for random ID, which we set here in the new action. And then we just end that off with a submit button. And there we go. That's the code now working. So what we should now do is run the server, and if we now go to the main page, it doesn't take us to the Rails splash page, it takes us straight to our shortened URL. So let's just stick a URL in there that I've already typed in. This should then go away and shorten that. Now before we go any further, I'm just going to examine the HTML, so I'm going to use inspect element, and in the form we should see there's a hidden input, which is what we created, and as you can see it's set the value to the randomly created string that we've created inside of our controller. So that's definitely working, and we've more or less confirmed that. So if I press this, we should go to there, and here we have it. There's two more URLs that I've already created, and there's the new one that I've created, and as you can see down in the bottom left hand corner, the URL that it's created is the IP address with the port 3000 /URLs / the random ID. So we've now got the random ID. So then if I click this link, it should pass me through inside of the code to the controller's show method, where we will pull out the ID from the params, search for that object based on the random ID value, and if we find it, pass back to the original URL that we've shortened. So here's goes. This is what should take a blink of an eye to do, so watch. There we have it. Very, very quickly done. So there you go. That's how to build a URL shortener with Ruby on Rails. I hope that you enjoyed this, and if you did, that's really great. Thanks for watching.